I realize now that after I made you all sit here all night that I better be like the Rolling Stones now, right? I have to be like damn good. I will try humbly to offer you all a little bit of entertainment and some thought. I'm going to try to read a couple of pieces. I know some of you have places to be. I understand that, so I'll jump right into it rather than making you continue to wait. But thank you all very much for being here, for joining me today. Where's my hat? Is my hat here?
You took it out of the box.
I took it out of the box. Oh, there it is. I have this hat. So a friend of mine gave me this hat, and even though my friend Josh actually requested something else that I might read in a few minutes, right now I just feel like reading this piece about this hat. One of the things I like to do in my writing is obsess on the objects around my house. So this piece is called The Howl Hat. My friend Sylvain went to San Francisco recently and brought us back some souvenirs as gifts. One of the places he visited on his trip had been City Lights Books. He brought me a t-shirt from there, and he also brought me one of the most complicated objects I've ever had in my possession, a khaki-colored baseball cap emblazoned with the word "Howl" in large black capital letters. The word, and the font it was printed in, referred to the landmark 1956 poem Howl by Allen Ginsberg, which, in addition to being widely considered one of the signal flares of the Beat generation, was also hugely influential for me personally. So my first reaction was to think of how much I loved the poem and how thoughtful the gift had been, to put the hat on and glance at myself smiling in the mirror. But then I took the hat off. For some reason, I was feeling a little bit queasy. As I looked down at the hat in my hands, it morphed into some kind of philosophical Rubik's Cube, and I found myself quickly mired in thickets of unnavigable implication. Of course, I wanted to be out there reminding people of Allen's work, spreading the message that his poetry was still relevant, but wasn't there some automatic conflict of interests between the Beat generation's tireless excoriation of middle-class American consumer values and the subsequent commodification of their image as a product? I decided to sit down for a little while. I thought of how disgusted I was when I first saw the ad campaign in which The Gap was posthumously using Jack Kerouac's image to sell their pants. "Kerouac wore khakis," read the tagline, printed across a picture of poor Jack from back in the 50s. At the time, my friend Bill Harper, another great poet who had helped to light my path, came up with the brilliant idea of Xeroxing pictures of Hitler with the SS and adorning them with the line, "Hitler wore khakis," before slotting them between all the pairs of jeans at the nearest Gap store in protest. That'll teach him. But this case was a little bit different. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the proprietor of City Lights Books, where this hat had been acquired, was also the guy who published the poem to begin with. So it's not like he was distributing these hats without the necessary consent. It is true that Allen is dead, so we can't be absolutely sure about what he would say, but when I assisted in the summer-long tribute to him at Nairobi University back in '94, I personally watched him autographing t-shirts with his own face screen-printed all the way across the front of him. So it's safe to say he wasn't altogether unfamiliar with the concept of apparel marketing. And Ferlinghetti, who callously grabbed my ass and made a lewd remark when I asked if I could show him some of my poetry that summer, has never seemed to me particularly above cynicism, so it's not clear that anyone's been sold out against their will here. Besides, these guys do sell books after all, and Allen even helps to found a school in Kerouac's name where tuition is charged, so it's not like he was ever really allergic to making a few bucks off of himself or the Beat thing. But then, when I wear the hat, what is it that I'm advertising? Is it Ginsberg or Ferlinghetti or their personal values? Or is it strictly the content of the poem? Or by advertising the poem, am I advertising for City Lights Books, who hold the publishing rights? And who gets the share of royalties that Allen would have gotten now that Allen is gone? And then I started to wonder if the sale of the hat product had been timed to coincide with the recent release of the 2010 film Howl, which dramatized the obscenity trial brought on by the publication of the poem. And in that case, would wearing the hat now also be advertising the film? And was the hat a licensed product of the publishing house or of the film studio? Could a share of the profits from the hat product be going back to the production budget of the movie, into the pants of some Hollywood producer, or James Franco's agent? Then I thought, well, at least I didn't pay for it myself. It's something I got for free. I didn't even have to work for it. I mean, for all I know, Sylvain didn't pay for it either. It might have just been a handout at a function he attended. Maybe I'm not economically supporting anything at all, not directly anyway. And the hat does advertise sincere values of mine by promoting a poem that I think is truly good, important work. Even if the poem isn't quite the singular piece of century-changing genius that its subject matter is, it's still probably worth seeing in its own right, especially since it serves as an introduction to Alan's work for a whole new generation. And don't we need to be building new vehicles to transport our sacred artifacts into the future? I mean, I'd love to think that my hat might cause some young person to go check out a movie about Alan and get pissed off about the persecution of poets by the McCarthy-era American courts. But then I got worried again. If the beats were about fighting the status quo and rejecting mainstream consumer values, hitting the road to find their own experience of the American dream without the prepackaged morality and stability that the culture was offering them, then putting that message on a hat and selling it, or buying it for that matter, suddenly becomes tongue-in-cheek, ironic, and there's nothing the next generation seems to have a firmer grip on than their sense of irony. The kids in the street have no way of knowing I didn't pay for the hat. So if I'm walking around wearing it in order to literally promote the message in the poem that it references, have I already failed? Am I so sure to be taken ironically that I'm actually making fun of the poem by wearing the hat? Can I even deter some cool young people from thinking they should see this movie or read this poem because I look like such an impossibly uncool middle-aged dimwit in this fucking hat? If I really want kids to read the poem, should I just get a marker and write the word howl on a plain white t-shirt? Or is that kind of DIY punk stuff already old and ironic as well? Anyway, even if Sylvain didn't pay for the hat, someone who sees me in it and likes it might be tempted to buy one for themselves. And even if all the money made by this product was going somewhere really, really decent, like say, City Light's ongoing effort to discover and publish new and exciting young poets after grabbing their asses, wouldn't I still just essentially be advertising the purchase of products as an expression of one's values, and how beat is that? I mean, whether it's baseball hats, movie tickets, or even books, if you're saving up your money or preserving your good credit so you can buy these objects as banners of your value system, then you're probably not off thumbing your way around the back roads of the country, smoking grass with jazz musicians and exploring your sexuality while spewing your cosmic soul vomit onto the pages of your tattered notebook. So, I decided to read the poem again and try to more accurately assess the potential conflicts between the values explicitly discussed in the poem and the ones implied by the ownership of the hat. I tried to imagine how I would feel if someone saw me wearing the hat, then went off to buy the poem, then came back to me to talk to me about the hat. And at first, this was not too troubling. After all, I wouldn't necessarily feel hypocritical if my hat were perceived to endorse drug experimentation, homosexuality, spiritual awakening, jazz music, or madness in the streets. And the bittersweet, tragic beauty of that madness is given a delicate, nuanced treatment in the poem. After all, there's a damn good reason why Alan's work didn't deserve to be labeled obscene. But things got a little more complicated when I took into account the whole book, Howl and Other Poems, in which this poem first appeared. It's the book in which new readers are still likely to find this poem if they go looking for it because of my hat. The book which also contains Ginsberg's poem, America, in which he reminisces fondly about his communist sympathies and bemoans the exploitation of the American worker. Thinking of all this, I grabbed the hat to check inside and see where it was made, and the tag said, "Made in China." Now, this was a whole new wrinkle in my problem. If the hat was made in a communist country, then does that support or exploit communism? On the one hand, it seems like any money sent to China on some level must help the Chinese, but what if the Chinese worker is being exploited? Or what if the communist countries are being exploited by the capitalist ones? Or if they're exploiting their own citizens in an ironic act of de facto capitalism? And how much of the money spent on the production of the hat actually goes to China anyway? Does most of that money go to China? Or does most of it stay here and a small amount goes to China? Now, of course, I'm in way over my head because I have no idea how international manufacturing deals are financed between nations that operate in supposedly opposed ideological economic systems. So whether the percentage of money going to China was high or low, I wouldn't have any idea what the ramifications are of that. But it would be nice to feel like I at least understand what it says on my hat. If we purchase and wear goods produced in communist countries, is that a symbolic endorsement of communism, like the opposite of when people say, buy American? Or is it simply an exploitation of a cost resale value ratio that's only possible because the US has a higher per capita income than China does, meaning that we can pay less money to a Chinese person to make things for us than we'd want to be paid to make the same things for ourselves? And if you're a communist, does that bother you? Or are you primarily concerned with having the same as your countrymen, regardless of what's had by those in other countries? Does communism depend on global economic equality, or is it satisfied with mere national economic equality? Honestly, I've never thought about that. And if we're buying all these hats from China, and China's getting rich, then why the hell do they still have so many hat factory employees? Is it because we're underpaying for the merchandise compared to some objective market value, or is it just because their population is so high? And is that hurting them economically, or is it helping them? Is their population growth actually a sign that they're thriving? And if that's the case, then has the Howl hat fallen back into literal lockstep with the sympathies expressed in Allen's poetry? Am I helping a communist nation to thrive by sending them another hat-making job that my own people are too damned lazy and entitled to want? And does that mean that the hat functions as a physical indictment of the same empty consumer culture that the Beats originally aims to question? What would the Beats think of all this? Would they wear a hat at all? Would they take sides in the discourse about China? I know they were quite fond of incorporating Eastern philosophy into their worldview. Allen was a devout Buddhist. But would Allen bother with explicit politics in his work, and would his work even make sense in another country? Or is he himself just a purely American product, a whale that could only have emitted from the tortured guts of the post-war American dream? On the flip side of the Made in China tag, it says, designed in America. So maybe the majority of the money that's paid for the hat is staying in the United States, where the intellectual property of it was born. But then, who's that money empowering in the US? Maybe the producers of the hat had to pay some small amount to the estate, or even back to themselves, to license the word and the corresponding font for the logo, but after that, where do the profits go? How high does that food chain climb? Who gets the final dollar? Is it just some random corporate glutton who doesn't even know that one of his business ventures has shamelessly sold out the anti-consumer element of the Beat Generation aesthetic? And who's sniffing Ferlinghetti's pockets? How many people are grabbing his ass? Printers, distributors, advertisers. What kind of cut is Amazon taking from the online sales? How high are the rents in San Francisco these days? Are any of the people who profit from this product even aware of their own stake in the irony? And if I think of all this stuff before I put on the hat in the morning, then when I wear it, am I being ironic regardless of my intentions? Is it clear to other people that I factored all these questions into my decision to wear my hat? Or might I come off like I haven't even thought about it, like I'm just some tourist who wandered through a literary movement on my summer vacation? I think of another poem in the book, A Supermarket in California, in which Ginsberg tries to commune with the spirit of Walt Whitman while roaming the neon-splashed aisles of the titular American grocery store. And I wonder if that's what I'm somehow trying to do with my hat. Trying to find the holy spirit of poetry lost among the objects being purveyed in the shiny apocalyptic marketplace of Occidental excess. But the person who sees me walking down the street in this hat can't possibly know that that's what I'm trying to do. I don't have any way of knowing who's going to see me in the hat. I imagine that what I'm advertising by wearing it will change completely depending on who I'm advertising to. So what if the people who see me wearing the hat don't take the time to think through all these issues that carefully? What if they just look at the surface? And what if the surface looks different to every person who sees me? Does it even matter whether or not I work out how I feel about all this shit? I might just wake up tomorrow and feel differently about the whole thing anyway. And I guess that just leaves me right back where I started. I put the hat on, I take the hat off, I put the hat on, I take the hat off. I've got a couple of themes in this book, a couple of sort of groups of pieces that are on similar subjects. And a few of them are about objects in my house that I obsess on. There's one in here that's like 6 pages about a bar of soap that sort of haunts me from a shelf where I'm trying to figure out what it's doing and what it's about. And I also write a bit about formative LSD experiences. I have a few pieces in here about that, which I might do. But I think what I'm going to do now, actually, I was talking to my friend Josh about this in the car. Several of you are friends and people I know from Paris, friends of Mary's, friends of Brian's, a friend of Richard's. And I have a piece about Paris that I haven't been reading very much on tour because it's been like emotionally hard for me to talk about Paris since, you know, stuff that's been going on there recently. But I feel like since there are a lot of people here who are connected to Paris and my heart's over there right now, I felt like maybe I should do one of my pieces about Paris. So I'm going to do that. And if you have to take off, it was nice meeting you.
Thanks.
And I'll drop you a line.
Okay.
This piece is called Suicide and Marrow Fat Peas. By the time I met Leslie, I was already accustomed to dipping in and out of homelessness. I'd lived in parks and on benches. I'd couch surfed all over the country, slept on the beach, slept on the bus for hours as it traveled around town, and I'd thumbed long distance rides just to fall asleep in strangers' cars. I was perfectly comfortable not worrying about where I was going to wind up sleeping on a given night. I knew that I could usually organize something, and if it fell through, I could always just scrape up some change for a refillable coffee at an all-night diner, or I could go read religious pamphlets at the bus station until the sun came up, when I could crash on the park bench without getting rousted by the cops. But Leslie didn't have these fallback habits in her arsenal. Before her relationship with me, she'd always had a steady place to live. So when we started traveling together and didn't always have plans for our sleeping accommodations, it tended to stress her out pretty badly. But she also started to fall for the lure of the road, and when we found ourselves getting stuck in a rut working miserable jobs, it didn't take long for us both to get the itch again. I suggested that we move back to Paris. That's where I had lived before I was with Leslie, and it was a place where I'd had a lot of luck slipping through the cracks. I'd found some interesting people to hang out with and lots of little ways to survive. I trusted Paris as a city that would always find a way to look after its dreamers. Leslie was game for the move, but she was a little more cautious than I was. We hardly had any money to leave with, maybe enough to get us through a few carefully managed months, and we only had a couple of shaky leads on places to crash. Leslie suggested that we just go over there for a few months so that we'd have a ticket back if things didn't pan out. Even if she was tentative about my assertion that somehow everything would be fine if we could just get back to Paris, she was also sick enough of our hamster wheel life in the States that she was willing to give it a go. We had pretty good luck on that first trip, finding temporary rooms and little gigs here and there to help pay for them. Leslie sold a few drawings and photos while I played guitar in a few bars. Eventually, her confidence increased, and we decided to try for a more long-term relocation. One of the great things we had going for us in Paris was the network of tiny little romantic apartments all over the city. They're generally referred to as chambres de bonne, or maids' quarters. Most of the older buildings in the city center have these small rooms which at one time were the sleeping chambers for the domestic help employed by the residents of the larger homes. They're often located on the top floor, cut off by the slant of the roof, and generally under 100 square feet in size. In fact, many of them are too small to be legally rented as living spaces under Parisian housing regulations, but this also makes them cheap. Unlike the housing in New York or London, where anything even remotely near the city center would cost thousands per month, these romantic little rooms scattered throughout the very heart of Paris can often be had for as little as a couple of hundred. So there's a thriving black market through which they are rented, exchanged, and acquired. They're prized by artists, writers, students, an affordable way for the less affluent among us to bed down in the City of Lights. And because they're in such high demand, if you want to hear about them, you have to be plugged into the network of expats and starving artists who pass messages about these places along a hidden grapevine like keepers of a secret handshake. When Leslie and I came back to stay, we floated in and out of temporary residence in several of these little rooms around town, and we managed to get ourselves tied fairly well into that grapevine. But it still wasn't exactly easy to find a permanent home. We'd get one for 2 months here or 3 months there, but then we kept finding ourselves back on the streets or crashing for short times with friends. this instability used to terrify Leslie. She took it more literally than I did. I'd learned from years of experience that first of all, that even when it doesn't, a night at the train station or a day spent sleeping in the park is never as bad as you abstractly fear that it will be. Leslie was starting to understand those things too, but the transitions were still putting her on edge. In March of 2004, we were staying in a cheap hotel down to our last few euros, and we were getting pretty close to rejoining the homeless population. Leslie was getting nervous, so I proposed what I always thought, and what I still think, is appropriate to do in such a situation. I suggested that we go down to the pub and start investing the meager remnants of our finances in some beer and conversation. Leslie thought I was nuts, wanting to waste both our precious time and our humble coins in an afternoon at the bar, but there was a method to my madness. When you're down on your luck, it's important to be visible, especially in places where you're a regular and the familiarity of your face has accrued a bit of sympathy and goodwill. When things aren't working out is when you most need a favor or the flash of inspiration that you might get from meeting someone new or overhearing a conversation, and you're not going to get that sitting in your room and counting your pennies. When you have a good-sized chunk of money, maybe it might be worth saving, but when you only have a few bucks, its greatest value is in the chair time it could buy you at the watering hole. I finally talked Leslie into it, partly because she didn't have any better ideas, and partly because I would have gone down there without her if I had to. We went to an old favorite bar on the Rue Mouffetard, where I knew the owner from my younger days. Leslie and I had frequented the place before and had reason to hope that we might run into an old friend or meet a new one or otherwise catch a lead on a place to crash. We went early when the beers were cheapest and got ourselves a couple of pints. Then we sat down at our usual end of the bar and got to work on the crossword puzzles in the English papers while we waited for some other regulars to pop their heads in and ask us how things were going. The English crosswords always posed a bit of an extra challenge to us, being that they so often incorporated cultural references, spellings, and phrasings that were foreign to the American vocabulary. This day's puzzle was no exception. After solving the bulk of it, we got stuck on the long two-word phrase running down the middle. We were confident about at least half of the letters, and they seemed to define the likely syllabic structure of some words, but the pattern didn't bring anything the least bit familiar to mind. Thankfully, our whining and grumbling was overheard by a young Irish language lover a few stools up the bar from us. This was the person who would go on to become our very dear friend Mark. He introduced himself and asked curiously what the trouble seems to be. When we showed him the puzzle, he realized straight away that the answer we had struggled so mightily to find was marrow-fat peas. Leslie and I had never heard of marrow-fat peas, so we were happy to be let off the hook by our new friend. Not only did we hit it off quickly with Mark, but when the conversation moved on to what we were all doing in Paris and we explained our predicament to him, his eyes flew wide in eureka recognition. He told us about how he had just met a young American guy in the preceding days who'd been trying to rent out a cheap little room as quickly as possible. He cautioned us that he had passed on the room itself due to some strange circumstances surrounding it, but suggested that if we were desperate, it might be just the right fit. So we assured him that we were, and that it was. So he offered to put us in touch with the guy and let the guy explain the unusual details to us himself. Mark called Anthony from the phone at the bar and told him he was with some people who might be up for renting the room. Then he handed me the phone. Anthony warned us that the place was tiny, but it was almost impossibly cheap. At 260 euros per month, we could almost find the rent just by looking for coins on the floor of the metro. He said he needed a renter as soon as possible, and I told him we'd take it, assuming I'd dig up the money somehow. But he thought it might be a good idea if he came down to the bar first to describe the complicated situation in person. Unfazed, we told him we'd be happy to wait, and then we joyfully ordered up a celebratory pint with Mark. When Anthony arrived, he explained that he had been subletting this apartment from a young German guy named Jan, who had recently taken his own life. He said that Jan's parents had come through town to pick up his belongings and arrange a memorial, and that they had told him it was okay for him to keep renting the flat. But since then, he said, they'd fallen out of touch. He had kept sending the rent to Jan's father for a while, but was no longer receiving a response. So Anthony, a college-age guy who was also on a tight budget, found other sleeping arrangements for himself and decided just to rent this place out. He wanted us to know up front that Jan's parents might resurface at any time and expect us to move out of the place. We were fairly used to these kinds of temporary arrangements, and anything was better than our impending homelessness. So we thanked him for the opportunity and got to work looking for the rent. Our friend Chris, who was in a similar situation at the time but had a small amount of savings, joined up with us and helped with the expenses. Despite the unusual circumstances, we were all relieved to have found a place to crash for a while. But once we moved in, we began to feel a little bit haunted by the story of Jan. Jan had been, we'll say, a troubled young man. And one day, he had knocked on the door of a stranger who lived on the top floor of one of the taller buildings in his neighborhood. When the woman who lived there had opened the door, he had calmly asked her, "May I use your apartment to kill myself?" When the slightly confused older lady didn't know how to respond, Jan had brushed past her, placed a single piece of paper on her table, crossed her living room to the balcony overlooking the street, and then walked straight off the balcony and fallen to his death below. The piece of paper Jan had left on the woman's table had read, "In Paris we live like dogs when we should be living like kings." And here we were, living in Paris, living in Jan's apartment. Jan had been a creative soul, and we felt connected to his struggle and felt honor-bound to try to get to know this mythical German martyr through the handful of artifacts he had left behind. Some homemade cassette recordings of jazz and classical music from the radio, some old black and white tourist photos printed on thick cards, a cracked chessboard with no accompanying pieces, a few odd bits of wooden furniture that Jan had fashioned himself. We mused over the possible stories behind these objects, and they began to inspire our own work. Leslie made drawings and photos of the things around the house, while Chris and I thought about Jan when we wrote. We imagined his spirit as a benevolent companion to our efforts as poor artists under the tiny anonymous roofs of Paris. We imagined that somehow he was rooting for us, that he would have related to our plight. The three of us were living on just a few bucks a day, which was enough to split up a 500-gram bag of pasta or rice, add in some cheap protein like a can of tuna, leaving enough left for the obligatory bottle of rot gut wine. Maybe we'd splurge on some tomato sauce or butter if one of us had scored some extra change that day. But we didn't earn too much since none of us left home very often. We were mostly focused on our creative endeavors. Not to mention that we were in the Montmartre neighborhood at the far north end of town, so anytime one of us wanted to visit friends or our old haunts in the downtown scene, it involved more than an hour of walking each way. We certainly faced some challenges that year, but thanks to Mark, Anthony, and Chris, at least none of us were on the street. We weren't starving to death. We all had someplace to work on our art, and for the time being, none of us, except Jan, were dead. We tried our best to honor Jan's memory and to see ourselves as kings rather than dogs. We carried on living there this way for a few months without any word from Jan's family, but one day when Leslie and I were out of town on a little hitchhiking trip, Chris was surprised by the arrival of Jan's father at the door. The father was equally surprised, not knowing who Chris was, and expecting either to find the place empty or maybe to run into Anthony. According to the father's side of the story, Anthony had simply stopped sending him the rent some months prior with no explanation. So he'd flown in from Germany to square things away with Jan's apartment and put it up for sale. He told Chris that he knew Anthony was in town and had spoken to him by phone, but that Anthony had been dodging him. Chris tried to be diplomatic and did his best to work out what was going on. He got in touch with Anthony himself, but Anthony was evasive about his reasons for avoiding the father, so Chris wound up dealing with the entire situation on his own. Jan's father was confused about Anthony's disappearing act and also about the story that led up to his son's apartment being full of people he didn't know who weren't paying him any rent. Chris could easily have just split and let the chips of the situation fall where they may, but instead he hung in there out of sheer sympathy in class and looked for a solution that would appease everyone involved. He didn't want Jan's grieving father to be left holding the bag during an already tragic time for his family, and he didn't want Leslie and me to return home only to find that we were back on the streets. Jan's father had his understandable doubts about leaving the apartment in the care of three people he didn't know, so Chris took the entirety of his savings and gave it to him, in good faith, as a couple of months' advance rent, so we could stay on while he was making his preparations to sell the place. Jan's father was touched by this gesture, and I think he was happy to know that the place his son had left behind was of sincere use to some creative young people. He graciously allowed us to stay there until he found a buyer, and he only took a few of Jan's furniture items with him before telling us that we could help ourselves to anything there that we might need. When the time came for the new owner to move in, it was Chris who found the lead on our next home, a tiny little top floor, slant roofed room in one of the old buildings on the Ile Saint-Louis in the middle of the Seine. The night that we moved there, we walked the whole way across town, carrying with us a pile of the essentials we'd adopted at Jan's place: the little cutting board, the knife with the broken tip, the slotted wooden stirring spoon, as well as the cassette tapes and the chessboard. These things all followed us to that next little room we lived in, and then to the next one after that. Chris kept the place on the island for a while, but Leslie and I eventually moved on to another chambre de bonne back over in Hemingway's old neighborhood off the left bank, where we still live today. And every night when I cook, I still use those kitchen utensils and think briefly of Jan. I try to remember with every meal I eat that we live on a fringe, a precipice, a cliff, where sometimes there's only space for us because someone else doesn't get that little bit of luck and decides that it's easier just to leap. So to anyone who's living like a dog in Paris tonight, I hope you catch a break. Hey, look at that. Beverage delivery. How are you guys doing? I know we started really late, so I don't know how tired you are. I could do another one if you want to hear another one, but.
Sure. Go for it.
Yeah? All right. Cool. Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, I'm still late. Actually, I was thinking about doing it, and I'm not going to do it because I don't want to rub my own face in my poop like a dog who soiled the rug. But I actually have a piece in here about how much I hate it when people are late and how militant punctual I am and how being late is the most awful thing you can do to people. And so I'm sitting up here thinking, oh my God, I'm such a dork. But in fact, I'm not going to read that piece because we don't need to all revel in how angry I am at myself. So I'm going to read something else. I think I'm going to read. Anybody into LSD? Yeah.
I did it 3 times years ago.
All right, that's cool. Okay, so you got a little bit of LSD.
All sexual. No.
So I was on Dead Tour for a bit when I was a teenager, and I was like a tournament level acid head for several years, and it's one of my favorite things to write about. There are several pieces in this book that break down and talk about LSD experiences that were really formative for me and had a lot to do with constructing my notions about life and writing and philosophy. And so I try to read one of them, every time I go out because they're so important to me. And I read, I'm not going to read the one I read last night because Josh here was in New Orleans with us last night. Josh had such a good time last night in New Orleans that he said, where are you going tomorrow night? We said, Austin. He said, awesome, is there room in the car? And he just got in the car and we drove him here and he's hearing me read again. So I'm not going to make him listen to the piece I read last night because that would be messed up. So I'll read you a different LSD piece. Different LSD piece for Josh. This one is called The Pike Out. In the summer of 1998, my brother John and I thumbed a ride to Prague, where we fell in with a large international group of travelers who were pulling a long stay at a cheap hostel there. After a few days, John decided to continue on to Poland, and I decided to hang out a little bit longer before heading back to Paris, where I was meeting up with some other friends. But what neither of us remembered was that my passport was in John's bag. When he left, I wound up getting stuck in Prague for several more weeks trying to resolve my status. John said he had put my passport in the mail addressed to the hostel, but as the days went by, it became gradually more obvious that it would never arrive. Luckily, the place we were staying served up 25-cent beers, and every 5th one was free if you brought back your empty bottles. They also charged by the bed rather than the person. So if someone was willing to share a mattress with you, you could stay a night for free. And needless to say, many of us became very close. It turned out not to be such a bad place to get stuck for the summer. Among the people I met that summer were friends I would know for years, people I would travel the world with, and a girl I would go on to almost marry. And each of those people deserves their own story, and the time in Prague might even get its own whole book someday. But for now, the relationship I want to talk about is the one I formed with Pike. His name wasn't really Pike, but it was one of those summers when a bunch of people bonded and gave each other nicknames. He had mentioned that he was from New Jersey, and someone asked, which exit? Citing the theory that everyone in New Jersey lived on the turnpike, So we jokingly referred to him as Turnpike, and then a few minutes later it came up that he was a fan of the band Fish, and someone else joked that a pike was a type of fish, and then someone made a remark about fishing out on the ground in the show, and then, from that point on I thought of him and still think of him as Pike. We hit it off quickly, and he seemed to gravitate toward the other people I was hanging around with, so a handful of us fell into a little tribe. The people who inhabited the hostel were always taking turns organizing various types of small group excursions, off to a bar on the other side of the city, or off to perform for spare change on the Charles Bridge, a ride on the funicular, up the hill to Petrin Tower, a visit to the cathedral where Mozart got married, or to the opera house where Don Giovanni had first been performed. But those of us who'd been there for a few weeks had already checked all those things off the list, and now we were mostly just sitting around at the hostel socializing and drinking beer. One night, we found ourselves gathered in a small group. It was me, Pike, the girl I'd been seeing, a girl Pike was hanging out with, and a mutual friend I'm going to call Kevin. Kevin had met a guy in a local bar who'd offered to sell him some acid, and he proposed that we all embark on our own special kind of travel excursion. We all agreed. We put in an order for a generous number of hits. Then when some of the other travelers began to turn in and the crowd in front of the hostel thinned down, the five of us snuck around the corner to the paved lot along the backside of the building where patrons and employees of the hostel would gather to play soccer in the afternoon. At night, there was nobody out there. So we all sat on the ground, dropped our doses, and hung out talking while we waited for this stuff to hit. I don't remember it coming on gently. In fact, the next thing I recall is that pretty early on in the trip, Pike and I were already getting confrontational with the boundaries of physical reality. One of us assaulted a trash can, and then at least one of us started crawling around the crumbly edge of the paved surface trying to eat the asphalt and concrete. Because in theory we're made up of the same stuff as everything else in the universe, so we should be able to merge with any other substance we want as long as we approach it right. Later, we would both remember ourselves being the one who tried to eat the pavement, so maybe we were sort of merging with each other to some extent at that moment. Shortly after we gave up on ingesting the parking lot, Pike started to go a little aggro, making references to violence. I could tell that it freaked out some of the other trippers who started wandering off to do their own thing, but somehow I followed it. I felt where he was at. The pavement eating thing had sort of started out lighthearted, but it had also posed limits against which we deeply wanted to rebel. Like, why were there things in the universe that we couldn't eat? Why were there laws of physics that extended beyond us so that we couldn't fully harmonize with everything in our vicinity? Why couldn't we pass through walls, or drink starlight, or fly, or make love to water? I think some of Pike's anger was coming from this place, this primal rebellion against the boundaries of our animalhood, and I really related to it. There was this beautiful cosmic oneness of everything that we could patch into and appreciate, but we were restricted in the ways in which we could interact with it physically. And those small practical limitations of matter had also snowballed into all kinds of other unnecessarily complicated bullshit realities, like having to compete for resources and social acceptance and work and money and the whole big system of gross gobbledygook that always dragged us back down to earth from this blissful perspective that we were aware of but could only ever seem to visit. Pike started losing his linear narrative a little bit, grunting, moaning, garbling sounds, strobing between darkness and tenderness, anger and tears, the joy of a newborn baby commingling on his face with the violence of a trapped wolf. I felt like I could see the cynical nihilism of his New Jersey adolescence flashing across his eyes in a rapid-fire series of winces and grimaces, and I totally got it. I was an East Coast kid too, and I knew the terror of feeling like your most precious moments of awakening might somehow always be trapped in a beer bottle or a nitrous balloon next to a pickup truck in some parking lot. But at the same time, fearing that the artificial tough guy posture you'd affected for surviving that environment was actually your truest nature. The struggle of trying to determine whether your most sincere self was a brutal, blood-hungry forest mammal or a cosmic spirit that transcended physical being altogether. And ultimately, just being so heartbroken by feeling disassociated from the truth of your own damned nature that all you can think to do is drink Rolling Rocks with your buddies and howl into the night in confused primordial agony. At least, that's what it seems like he was going through. At one point, Pike sort of disconnected and the animalistic groans subsided to a bit of mumbling. His eyes shifted back and forth distractedly like he was calculating something, like he was working through the physics in his head. He gradually sat down and then lay down on his back and then eerily ceased moving altogether. I sat down beside him and asked if he was okay. He looked straight up at the sky and said in a perfectly calm voice, "I think I'm going to stop." I asked what he meant, but I knew before he started trying to explain it. He was going to stop functioning. He was deciding to stop inhaling oxygen and stop injecting it into his blood, stop pumping blood, stop moving his cells around, stop actively inhabiting his system. I felt like I understood exactly what he was proposing, and I thought if he did it, that he might just disappear before my eyes. That without actively magnetizing the busy bustle of all his atoms and molecules, he could simply disperse and vanish from my plane of existence. But at the same time, I also wondered if maybe he would just physically die and leave me in a parking lot in Prague with a corpse waiting for the pigs to show up. Kevin was there again, and he was starting to freak out, suggesting that we should call a doctor or something. I had to sternly warn Kevin against this. I knew that Pike could be retrieved from where he was at conceptually, but I could not vouch for what would happen to any of us if we got tangled up in the darkness of cops and ambulances dragging us off in different directions, all speaking Czech to us in the middle of the night, some of us not even having passports. So I spoke as forcefully as I could and managed to convince Kevin to let me handle it. Then I asked Pike, as sweetly as I could, to please stay with us instead of leaving. I could tell that it was a struggle for him to even respond, like the majority of his willpower had already left us all behind. But he contorted himself and managed to wail one guttural syllable through his teeth, the word, "Why?" And I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say. But without thinking about it at all, I responded, "Love." This seemed to get his attention, but not quite convince him. "Love?" he asked, half inspired, half skeptical, his tough Jersey guy anger face and his tender, innocent child of the universe face started swapping back and forth again as he tried to compute the word, alternating confusedly and blending with each other like an angel and a demon at war for his soul. I couldn't explain or defend the word love. I didn't even know why it had come out of my mouth. But I knew for whatever reason that I loved Pike, and I told him that I loved him, that I didn't want him to stop, and that I didn't know what that love would become if we were no longer vibrating as these physical beings that were visible to each other. I tried to explain that I was afraid if we stopped living as animals that all our emotions would go away too, that if we dispersed back into the energy of the universe, that even the beauty we perceived in that would also disperse, that we were the only things keeping love alive, whatever it was. I wanted to try to tell him what love was or what it meant, but I couldn't. There were no words for that. Either love was something tangible that we could feel in our bodily incarnations, or it just wasn't. And if it wasn't, then I didn't know what else to tell him to keep him interested in the physical realm. So I just put my hand on his chest and looked into his eyes and repeated the word like a mantra. I didn't know what it even meant to me as I said it, but it felt like it meant something. Maybe it even just meant something scientifically basic, like the desire that certain molecules have to bond together into larger compounds as a way of defending themselves against disintegrating and spreading out again into the darkness of space. Do molecules feel any need to know and explain why they do that? Whatever it meant, or didn't mean, It worked. I don't know how long I sat with him like that, but Pike eventually came around. He decided that he didn't want to stop anymore. I don't know to what extent it's considered scientifically possible to just stop, but I was thoroughly convinced that night that the choice was all his. We shared some teary post-traumatic smiles and hugs, like the ones shared by firemen who have just rescued a kid and his kitten from a burning building in a movie. The other people we'd been tripping with reappeared from their own adventures. One had been wandering in a small patch of woods, one had been meditating off in a corner. They all expressed their happiness at having Pike back among us. Everyone had peaked, and we were all safely back at the little seating area near the front door of the hostel, the place where everyone regularly gathered each evening to sit in plastic chairs and drink their beers, discussing the day's adventures in tourism. And there, we began our gradual deceleration back to daily life thinking. Pike, by this time, was completely naked. But it didn't seem the least bit out of place to anyone. He even walked in and went up to the counter to get some water, and the person at the desk just smiled at him peacefully. When he came back, he sat down next to the girl he was with. He was naked in the doorway to the hostel, which wasn't even a hostel anymore. It was a gigantic shrine to interstellar awakening, whose front door only existed as a graphic element within which to frame Pike as the icon. And the girl was his angel, beaming perfect celestial love that bathed him like a warm light. And the glow from inside the hostel backlit them like a holy painting. Pike was reclined in the form of a Greek statue, and without the slightest hint of self-consciousness, he began to urinate. Neither of them moved. I think I heard someone laugh, like a distant echo, but I was just transfixed by the picture. His position caused the stream to arc upwards and away from him in a graphic line that completed the composition of the tableau. He stared straight ahead, serenity in his face, a classical fountain, a god of antiquity. He had purified himself beyond all the concerns of the mortal world. And his angel didn't seem to mind. She just continued to beam. The scene held for quite some time and is my final and enduring image of that night, the human fountain of cosmic truth. Come to think of it, I'm not even sure that Pike's girlfriend had taken anything with us. I think she was just totally intuitively at ease with what he was going through. And they just started spending time together earlier that day. And later on, they'd go on to marry. Now, they have two beautiful cherubic children in a little home in the New Jersey countryside with a vegetable garden. I went on to have long friendships with several of the people I met that summer in Prague, but none so close or so dear as the one I still have with Pike and his wife. I still admire the beauty that I saw in them as newly anointed young gods of the cosmos. I still look into Pike's eyes when I see him and think about love in a way that's beyond my definitions. And I still see the way I feel about him as a good enough reason for neither of us to stop inhabiting organic systems. Yeah, so I was lucky enough to see Pike in New York a few weeks ago, the second reading on this tour, and I did that piece, and he was happy. So, yeah, I don't know what time it is. I imagine you guys are probably hoping to close or something, right? I don't know what time. It's 8:30. You guys, when do you guys close?
We close at 8.
Oh.